finalmente llegamos a esta última conversación, Biosemiótica y Multiculturalismo. Muchas gracias a todos por conectarse. Sergio va a estar acá con nosotros un momento para traducir los saludos que va a realizar nuestro decano de la Facultad de Educación y la profesora Neila, para que luego todos, este canal va a realizarse toda la ponencia en idioma inglés y nosotros pasaremos al canal para que se realice la traducción. Como les mencionaba en el momento, tuvimos un error técnico. Cuando pasen al canal va a ser en idioma inglés, ¿cierto? Para que todos estemos allí conectados. Sergio, ya estás con nosotros. Decano, bienvenido y muchísimas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación a este cierre de este ciclo de conversaciones.
Manuela, muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias también nuevamente a todas las personas que nos acompañaron en este ciclo de conversaciones del IASS 2020 para la Universidad de Antioquia, Facultad de Educación. Ha sido un privilegio poder haber sido su anfitrión junto con la institución educativa Salazar y Herrera, la Corporación Universitaria Minuto de Dios Uniminuto, la Universidad de Medellín, la institución universitaria ITM, la institución universitaria Pascual Bravo y la red SEMA, Red de Semiótica de Antioquia. Ha sido un privilegio tener a expositores de la talla que hemos tenido en este evento, académicos brillantes y de primera línea que nos han permitido conocer y compartir ese conocimiento maravilloso. Esta pandemia nos ha quitado muchas posibilidades. Una de ellas es poder encontrarnos y reunirnos y estar juntos en un mismo espacio. Sin embargo, esta pandemia también nos ha permitido encontrar alternativas y una de ellas es ver en estas tecnologías una posibilidad para encontrarnos de manera sincrónica y asincrónica en otros escenarios y en otros espacios y poder compartir ese conocimiento de manera global. Otra de las enseñanzas muy importantes es que estos medios de comunicación y este discurso que tenemos sobre la semiótica cobra una total relevancia en lo que es y serán estas formas de comunicación. En este sentido, ahora más que nunca este discurso cobra la mayor relevancia y la mayor importancia. Para no extenderme, dado que tenemos unos invitados también de lujo, finalmente agradecer al doctor Paul Cobley habernos tenido en cuenta y esperamos poder seguir contando con su valioso apoyo, seguir pensando que la Universidad de Antioquia, Facultad de Educación y las universidades aliadas son parte importante de este compromiso académico. A la profesora Neila, mil gracias por haber pensado en esta universidad y a todo el equipo de académicos que nos acompañaron. Muchísimas gracias y estamos en toda la disposición para que cuando esta pandemia cambien las condiciones y podamos volver a estar juntos, lo esperamos en Colombia, los esperamos a todos en la Universidad de Antioquia y nos podamos encontrar como nos gusta, viéndonos, acercándonos, como es una tradición muy latinoamericana de ser muy cercanos. Muchísimas gracias y felicitaciones por este maravilloso evento.
Continuamos entonces con el saludo de la profesora Neila, quien presentará también a nuestros invitados. Profesora Neila, cordial saludo, bienvenida. No sé si acepta entonces, por el momento, o sea, usted va a realizar el saludo en español y Sergio va a realizar la interpretación por párrafos porque usted ya lo tiene en su escrito, ¿cierto?
Sí, señor. Manuelita, muchas gracias. Agradezco mucho esta oportunidad. Buenos días para todos y todas, apreciados amigos, colegas. Deseo expresar a nombre del comité organizador, donde elaboramos mancomunadamente con el profesor Jorge Ureña, mi agradecimiento de manera muy especial a la Universidad de Antioquia, al señor decano Dr. Wilson Bolívar Buriticá y al profesor Edgar Ocampo, a la profesora María Cecilia Plester, al equipo de comunicaciones, en especial a su coordinadora Manuela Castaño, al equipo de traducción, especialmente en el día de hoy a Sergio, y a las instituciones asociadas que ya se mencionaron. Quiero resaltar también la presencia de la Asociación Colombiana de Semiótica y la Federación Latinoamericana de Semiótica, FES. El ciclo de conversatorios de la IASS AIS 2020 cierra hoy el gran reto de haber realizado en la ciudad de Medellín por 10 semanas consecutivas el evento preparatorio al primer encuentro de investigadores de carrera temprana en estudios semióticos. Con el apoyo restricto de la IASS AIS, entre el 4 de agosto y el 6 de octubre, hemos contado con la participación activa de 10 investigadores senior y 18 investigadores de carrera temprana, en mesas de trabajo donde la semiótica, en tanto ciencia con clara vocación transdisciplinaria, nos permitió reflexionar en la actual coyuntura sobre la publicidad, la pedagogía, la educación, las cosmogonías y los rituales, las ecologías, los medios, las narrativas, los discursos, el cuerpo, la transmedialidad, para culminar hoy con la biosemiótica y la multiculturalidad. En todos los casos fue transversal al análisis las coyunturas que estamos viviendo en el mundo contemporáneo, particularmente la pandemia, con sus significados y sus consecuencias socioculturales. La Asociación Internacional de Semiótica ha sido un espacio de encuentro en el que sus miembros aportaron su trayectoria investigativa desde las más diversas áreas de formación e interés de investigación. La realidad de este encuentro se materializa más allá de la presencialidad en las aulas virtuales, que contó en promedio en cada sesión con cerca de 167 personas registradas y 130 personas activas por salón y por sesión. Mientras en Facebook se alcanzó una media de 1.400 reproducciones por video. Más allá de las cifras, el verdadero sentido de este evento es haber consolidado un espacio para el encuentro y el diálogo más humano, que se manifestó sistemáticamente en los mensajes de amistad entre los miembros de la comunidad de semióticos del mundo. Desde el punto de vista académico, los investigadores de 2 generaciones hicieron viable un debate que permitió discutir nuestros problemas y nuestras ideas, ubicándolas siempre en la coyuntura sociopolítica y cultural del momento, para gestionar redes de conocimiento, nuevos proyectos, alianzas interinstitucionales, entre otras acciones que pudiéramos registrar más puntualmente. El siguiente aspecto se conecta con el valor que le estamos otorgando a las relaciones humanas entre los investigadores de América Latina y el mundo, los cuales no solo fortalecen los vínculos entre investigadores, sino que dan paso a la construcción de redes científicas para nuevos encuentros que garantizarán una ciencia fortalecida por su transversalidad y su capacidad para convocar todas las preocupaciones más actuales del hombre contemporáneo y pensar cómo se puede llegar a transformar la sociedad del futuro. En la base de esto transita la idea de un modelo más justo e igualitario, con mayor capacidad de humanización, fundamentado siempre en el carácter dialógico del ser humano. El esfuerzo realizado colectivamente por el Círculo de Estudiosos de la Semiótica que participaron en los conversatorios, el equipo organizador del evento, las instituciones que nos han apoyado, han dado un magnífico fruto con profundo valor científico y nos ha permitido disfrutar de unos conversatorios a través de los cuales hemos transitado la maravillosa experiencia de estar con los otros. Me permito ahora hacer la presentación de nuestros conferencistas invitados. La 10ª sesión de conversación se cierra con 2 notables académicos. En primer lugar, el doctor Paul Cobley, presidente de la IASS AIS, y el doctor Alin Olteanu. Bienvenidos, apreciados amigos. El doctor Paul Cobley ha sido profesor, conferencista e investigador de la Universidad de Middlesex desde 2013. Fue profesor de semiótica y comunicaciones en la Universidad Metropolitana de Londres. Estudió en la Universidad de Sussex. Entre sus intereses se encuentra la semiótica, en cuyas líneas de investigación incluye biosemiótica, zoosemiótica, cibersemiótica y la teoría de la comunicación, la narrativa, la subjetividad y los géneros populares. Su publicación más reciente es un capítulo del libro titulado Reimaginando la semiótica en la comunicación. Mil gracias, querido presidente de la IASS. El doctor Alin es investigador del Departamento de Semiótica de la Universidad de Tartu y de la Universidad Tecnológica de Kaunas. Ha desarrollado trabajos con enfoque semiótico-teórico de la educación, las correlaciones entre las nuevas alfabetizaciones y el las ciudades cosmopolitas, el mundo cosmopolita, y sobre el multiculturalismo. En la actualidad, su labor se centra en entender unos puentes entre las teorías biosemióticas, la ecosemiótica, en un reciente marco de estudios como el de la multimodalidad. Al final, el doctor Paul Cobley cerrará este evento en calidad de presidente de la IASS AIS y nos dará en ese momento un interesante plan de trabajo que incluye nuestros futuros encuentros con los jóvenes de recientes carreras en el campo de la semiótica. Nos hablará de las actividades del colegio y de la gama de oportunidades que le ofrece la IASS a toda la comunidad de científicos y académicos de la semiótica. Bienvenidos todos. Tiene la palabra el profesor Cobley.
Alin, I'll probably say something first in order to get us kicked off. I'd like to introduce myself, Paul Cobley, and Alin Olteanu. Alin and I have been friends for quite a long time. I think, Alin, you're still considered to be an early career researcher. It's been some time since you completed a PhD, but would you still say that you're an ECR?
Thank you. Yeah, I would say so. I've been advancing rather slowly, I think.
Okay, very modest. So we will have a conversation. The title was Biosemiotics and Multiculturalism. We will try to proceed in a peripatetic way. Okay, so we will try to explain our terms as often as possible for people who are not necessarily familiar with some of the things, some of the issues that we will touch on, some of the concepts. Although I imagine that people are quite proficient in a lot of these issues regardless. And then the other thing that I should say is that because we've known each other for quite a while, we wanted to conduct this a little bit like we would conduct a conversation in the corridor of a conference, or, you know, even better, a little bit like the conversation that we would have in a bar if we were drinking. So in the early part of the evening rather than in the later part of the evening when we'd had too much to drink. Okay, so of course, we will have to go reasonably slow in order to facilitate the translation. So it may not have exactly the rhythms of a barroom conversation, but nevertheless, we will try our best. So I will ask for the PowerPoint slides to move from one to the next, and we've got fairly distinct questions on each slide. Some notes there in Spanish and some notes in English as well for those who are listening to the English version. And it's probable that our answers will be slightly longer than the notes that you encounter on the slides. So if we could go to the next slide, please.
Just before we get into the meat of things, I would like to quickly, first of all, thank you very much to Professor Neila and to Jorge and to everyone involved in organizing these cycles of conversations. I think this has been a great idea and greatly implemented. It has kept us engaged during the pandemic, as some people were saying earlier. And I would like to apologize. I must have made a mistake, because if I understood well how I was presented, I am not anymore a researcher at Tartu University. My main affiliation now is RWTH Aachen University in Germany. I should mention my employer. Thank you.
Yes, Middlesex University for me. Okay, so shall we go to the next slide?
Absolutely.
Oh, look, both of us have written books. Both of them are published by Springer. They're different because Alin's has got a red cover, mine has got a green cover. Nobody can afford to buy any of them, and I don't think that anyone has read either of them.
And as a piece of advice, don't buy the red one. Don't consider buying it. Yeah, I wrote books. I'm surprised every time I'm reminded about that. I guess that our conversation today will revolve around these two books. I also find, of course, very fortunate the topic that the organizers of the cycle of conversations chose in general, and particularly for this conversation, biosemiotics and multiculturalism, which for some might sound like a random coupling. Biosemiotics and multiculturalism, what's the link? Well, I guess this is what I tried to. This is what I was led to explore into my book. This book was published about 2 years ago, and I started work. Most of the work on it ended more than 2 years ago. Well, 3 years ago, really. It came out of a postdoc position that I had for 2 years at Kaunas University of Technology in Lithuania, and over there I had to work on multiculturalism, which of course is one of my interests. And in my approach to multiculturalism, I found two pillars. One is a criticism of mainstream multiculturalism that is primarily championed by two scholars, Jens Martin Eriksson and Fredrik Stjernfeldt. Fredrik Stjernfeldt, who is very well known in the world of semiotics too, but he is active in many domains of research. And the second pillar of my own work on multiculturalism is Paul's biosemiotic discussion of culture, precisely what the green book over here does. Because what I found is that culture looked at from this biosemiotic perspective as presented by Paul, manages to avoid many faults that Eriksson and Stjernfeldt found in the mainstream construals of multiculturalism and of the implementation of in its implementation in policy.
I should just add something very general for our audience, Alin, and it's simply this. I think probably both of these books agree that some some theories and some policies to do with multiculturalism are questionable, but one thing that that unites these two books is the idea of multiculture. You know, for both of us, multiculture, for reasons that we'll probably discuss, is absolutely inescapable.
Yeah.
Okay, so Alin, the title of this talk is Biosemiotics and Multiculturalism. The term biosemiotics, as opposed to semiotics, suggests that the two things are different. Is this true?
To begin with, I think this is another common starting point in our books. I think of biosemiotics as a school of semiotics, namely that school of semiotics that is characterized by considering meaning coextensive with life. Therefore, yeah, a lot of biosemiotic studies look at meaning aside the strictly human world, but what really characterizes biosemiotics is that it looks at meaning wherever, from the perspective that meaning is a general attribute of life, in the biological sense.
Let me put that a little bit more strongly. I mean, I'd say in answer to the question, is this true? I'd say no. Semiotics and biosemiotics are the same thing. Hopefully we'll be able to make a case for that in our discussion today. Of course, you know, there's a tendency to draw into schools. You know, sometimes that can lead to sectarianism and so forth. So I worry about that, and perhaps biosemiotics, you know, is pushed into the school position. But simply for me, biosemiotics simply designates the recognition that semiosis takes place across all realms of life, like you said. And if you compare that with some people who say that they're doing semiotics, and I do this as well, I'm often doing cultural semiotics, where I'm looking at human practices, you know, typically advertising or literature practices of that kind. There's a significant difference in outlook, but sometimes there's a very similar approach in both biosemiotics and semiotics. One extension on that I would suggest, and I guess you would have something to say about this, is that not only is it the case that we're in a world of meaning, but also, in a sense, human sign users may be signs amidst semiosis as a whole. So there is an issue there, I think, which biosemiotics tends to point out, and it's this: if you are doing cultural semiotics and you are looking at discrete sign systems here, there, and in different places, that's fine. That certainly is something that is possible to do. But it can be pointed out to you that when you do that, and I confess that I do it as well, you are automatically positing that you are a self-identical being, that you are autonomous, and that you are not caught in those sign systems until they act upon you at some stage, until you see an advertisement, or until you read literature, or you know, given that we're talking about multiculturalism, until you make a racist statement, for example. Okay, and in this idea of biosemiotics, I think that humans are plunged into semiosis, and sometimes they're part of the science systems in the traditional, you know, almost in the traditional post-structuralist fashion.
Indeed, I think that you expressed very well what in both of our reviews makes an approach to a biosemiotic approach to multiculturalism salient. Namely the fact that in biosemiotics there is an emphasis on the way in which biosemiotics is theoretically formulated. There is an emphasis on the interconnectivity of agents of meaning. in networks of meaning that cannot be singled out, isolated one from the other.
So, Alin, how did you get into biosemiotics? Is there a story to tell there that would be instructive?
Thank you. I think yeah, exactly. We can look at the next slide. I think my story there is very short. I started to read on biosemiotics several years ago during my master's in cognitive semiotics, which I did at Aarhus University in Denmark. That was a master's in cognitive semiotics. As it happens right now in Aachen, I also work in a cognitive semiotics department. And as a young BA student, I became interested in semiotics because I found that semiotics is a philosophical framework for looking at communication in a way that is not reductivist, like I found some language-centered approaches to be, like analytic philosophy or much of linguistics really as well. And I don't want to fall in the trap of sectarianism that Paul very well alarmed about earlier. But I found that semiotic views on communication and culture would not reduce the content by which humans communicate to strictly quantifiable information or verbalizable forms. And it would rather take into account the complexity of meaning in which humans live. And when I started my master's in cognitive semiotics, I had to realize at some point, and I think Professor Fredrik Stjernfeldt influenced me a lot in that regard. He was a professor at Aarhus at that time, and I took some courses with him. I realized that my thinking was outdated. I was thinking like a 19th century philosopher. At least I was thinking like Descartes. I was a dualist because I thought that meaning is something that happens in the human mind alone. And what directed me into biosemiotics is the recent revolution, I guess, in linguistics towards embodiment. Like cognitive linguistics, for instance, like cognitive semiotics, biosemiotics accounts for knowledge as embodied, and hence, as a semiotic theory, by looking at knowledge as constituted of meanings, it looks at meanings as embodied. And I think that biosemiotics has another particular insight to offer, perhaps a bit in complementarity to cognitive approaches, and that is, it accounts for the environmental dimension of meaning, which is, I think, what Paul was saying earlier, where it was talking about how science systems cannot, in actual fact, be separated one from the other. And the starting point in biosemiotics of regarding environments as products of organisms' understanding of the landscape stuck to me as a making a shortcut now as a step out of modern dualism.
Well, it sounds to me as though you had much more accelerated development than I did, which may be simply because you are far more intelligent than I ever was, which I envy, of course. But my development is not dissimilar in that I discovered when I was at university in the 1980s, I remember, in fact, the day that someone came around to the flat where I was living as a student and told me there was this thing called semiotics. Somebody had given a lecture on Saussure, and they couldn't quite work out what it was, but they knew that it was important. And it was round about then that I also read in English translation The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. So when I was doing my PhD some years later, I was teaching communication studies, and although I hadn't got on to the theory of embodiment, I did realize, very slowly, that we were teaching communication studies as though you could analyze a cultural artifact, and then once that's done, you could go home and rest. You needn't think about semiosis after that at all. Then in the early 90s, I started to, late 80s, early 90s, I started to read Tom Seebeok's work. And I saw him I met him briefly at the IASS World Congress in Berkeley in 1994. And after seeing the kind of papers that were happening at that Congress, I thought there's no way that I can continue to say that I'm doing semiotics. It's like what I was doing was like being, well, it was like having a huge, massive mansion, but only occupying the little cupboard under the stairs. So for me, things changed after that. I started to read more science books. I started to read Peirce, and again, it was this issue, which will come out in our discussion of multiculturalism, about the autonomous subject. I think there's a strong connection between the idea that the autonomous subject is to be criticized as an idea, and your notion of or the theory of embodiment in general. As soon as you start to realize that there's this thing called endosemiosis, that there's signs that are happening in the body, well, the few cerebral movements that you get in cultural artifacts seem to pale into insignificance by comparison.
I think that.
Shall we go on to the next slide?
It's an insightful story there, and I'm sure, of course, you were joking, of course, earlier, but just for clarity's sake, if there's a reason for which I found my way into biosemiotics quicker than you have, is completely circumstantial, and as I mentioned, Frederick Schoenfeld plays a big part there, and among some others, you also play an important role there.
You're kind. Right. So, do you consider yourself, therefore, a semiotician or a biosemiotician?
Right. As I put it on the slide in so many words, Umberto Eco was a semiotician. Seebeok probably goes by the label of both, right? Because as you said, I think you are following Seebeok when you say, as you said earlier, that the biosemiotics is semiotics. And I consider myself just a bloke, just a guy, just a dude. Why? Because I think that the really big names that define the discipline, yeah, we can label them as semioticians, as philosophers, as whatever they should be labeled as. But in my yet early career stage, there's a danger in labeling. The danger is that we commit, again, the error, the fallacy of isolating sign systems among them. And it's hubris, isn't it, that makes us do that? Am I a semiotician? I don't know. It's unimportant, really. Umberto Eco was a semiotician because semiotics would look very different today without him, but not because of who he was, if that makes sense. And was my contribution to any discipline so far is very limited. And I notice how we often have the tendency to be labeled experts, professionals in this or that field, and we then journals, research funders, whatnot, start asking for our expertise in reviewing and so on, on that particular subject, but on that particular subject only. And all too easily, academics are too easily deemed experts in some niche, which also means all too easily excluded from dialogue with other disciplines. So I'm trying to stay away from labels.
Well, I fully understand that. You know, and I agree with that. Although I would tend to say that I was a semiotician, not a biosemiotician so much, a semiotician, only insofar as I hang on the coattails of all the people who do really good work. I mean, the most brilliant person I ever met was Tom Seebiok. But Tom Seebiok, one of the things that made him brilliant was that he knew that he couldn't do all the work. He wanted a network. He wanted a global network of scholars working on the project of semiotics. And I think it's the only way forward. That's why he was very interested in people who are conveners, like the conveners of this series of seminars. So I would only say, yes, I'm a semiotician in that sense. But in distinguishing it from being a biosemiotician, I just wanted to suggest to you something that was heavily on my mind and quite important, I think, in perhaps explaining our positions to people who may not know so much about biosemiotics, and that is that we would never, well, I mean, very seldom talk about biosemiosis. You know, that's not the prevalent thing. We all trade in semiosis. You know, everyone here on this panel and in the attendees, we're all trading in semiosis. But there's another thing which I think is quite important too, and it's to do with Peirce's concept of thirdness. But we needn't restrict ourselves to Peirce. I would also say that in our founding mother, Lady Welby, okay, Victoria Lady Welby, and then later in Ogden and Richards, and then especially in Roland Barthes, you get the idea that the connotation comes before denotation. That's to say, we're always in thirdness, we're always in media res. We don't start from first principles. You know, so I sometimes get the idea that people think if you're a biosemiotician, day one, when you go in to do biosemiotics, you start with a very low threshold. You start with signs at the level of a cell, and then you see how they're built up. But that doesn't happen. We start with thirdness. We're in media res. We are in the position where we have to deal with connotations coming first. You know, particularly in human semiosis. Okay, so we have to deal with that. And John Dealey put forward a good point in this respect. He said about science in general, but about how signs habitually work, is that they're always looking forward. So it's a little bit like getting the light from a star. You know, so we get the light, but it's actually quite old by then because semiosis is always going forward.
That's very profound insight, I think. And there's been a lot of confusion there. For instance, for his terminology of firstness, secondness, thirdness, Peirce is sometimes criticized for endorsing a substantialist ontology. But I think which is a very, very fair, important discussion to have. But I think the way I read Peirce, he's on the side of things that you just explained. And first, as funny as it might sound, firstness is not first in experience, in our waking experience. And I think that Percy's writings get that across quite clearly, which is, and it is here where we see why, and I think that at this point we can get more into the meat of things. It is in this sort of matters where we see why Peirce has been so inspirational, actually foundational for the biosemiotics later to come with Sebeok.
Let's go on to the next slide, and we'll actually get on to multiculturalism now for our audience who might be irritated by the delays. So, does biosemiotics have a different approach to multiculturalism than semiotics?
Difficult question, but difficult question to approach theoretically. But if I think that history of ideas, or the history of ideas of the 20th century, gives an insight here. I take issue with a construal of multiculturalism, which is mainstream, which is rather common. In the same way as I mentioned earlier, Erikson and Sternfeld do. They are not the only ones to come up with this criticism, but I think that they were particularly convincing. They criticize multiculturalism understood as based on the doctrine of culturalism. Culturalism, in a nutshell, is the idea that cultures are, that we can talk about culture in the singular, that there is a French culture in distinct from German or British culture, and so on, and that they are clearly distinct and identifiable, and that they determine to a large extent these singular unitary cultures. They determine to a large extent the thinking and the behavior of the individuals that belong to them. And therefore it's the doctrine that culturalism is possible leads to an idea of multiculturalism as a sum of distinct cultures coexisting along each other. And this is fake to how culture really is. Not that I can say how culture really is, but what I can say is that the borders that classic anthropology has drawn between supposed cultures are artificial. By now we know there's actually no empirical foundation for differentiating cultures one from the other. We can, of course, we can pick up different cultural habits here from there, different cultural elements, but not, there is no empirical foundation to account for boundaries between cultures as different semiotic systems. And this idea has been put forth to begin with by, actually by 19th century Romanticism. It comes from Humboldt and Herder, but it was taken on by the early American anthropologists, by the Boasian school, and throughout the 20th century, more often than not, semiotics has also endorsed this idea. During the 20th century, much of semiotics has been highly culturally relativist and epistemologically relativist, and also language-centered. So it went hand in hand with the doctrine of culturalism. And hence my answer to the question, biosemiotics, by studying culture, as you put it, Paul, in your book, by studying culture in the interrogation of modeling, eschew culturalism, which is actually an isolationist and post-colonialist view.
Well, Alin, I think you're absolutely right about that. If you look at the early volumes in semiotics, such as approaches to semiotics, that edited volume, you know, some of the conferences that were going on very much about a cultural anthropology perspective. with all the inheritances of 19th century anthropology. You can kind of see the struggle to get away from that. But you know, even in the 1970s, Umberto Eco was referring to semiotics largely as a kind of cultural anthropology. In a way, although he was torn in different directions as well. I think in Sebioc you see it probably a bit more clearly. One observation that he makes is that the culture is simply that minuscule part of nature which is compartmentalized by some anthropologists. So I think the phenomenon that you were referring to in terms of culturalism as opposed to multiculturalism, you know, multiculturalism, the theory of multiculturalism is an attempt to kind of settle its accounts with the problems thrown up with culturalism. But I think that the phenomenon that probably you and I are interested in is, well, the opposing force, which is a synechist approach, or synechism in Peirce's terms. And if you remember, Peirce says that we need synechism because there's this tendency to chop things up with an axe and put them into separate parts. I mean, he's simply referring to approaches to knowledge in that respect. But it's a very potent view that, you know, we do this in folk thought, and we do this in more sanctioned scientific ways. You know, certainly in the hard sciences, you know, that was the model 100 years ago. But his synechist perspective is much more far-reaching and revolutionary in that respect.
Certainly. So, I guess making a abrupt shortcut, I guess how we both see things is that by understanding culture as a product of biology, particularly of biological evolution, and see if we see a let's say vertical continuity in meaning across in meaning development across biological evolution, or in competence of meaning making, to be more precise, then that continuity is also inherited, let's say, on a horizontal axis across science systems. If we accept that culture is a product of biological evolution, then it occurs that we cannot divide the cultural world of humans and of other species into distinct, isolated science systems.
Yes, absolutely. The only thing that I would challenge you on, just reasonably mildly, is outside our field, you know, when we talk about biological evolution, it's assumed that necessarily is associated with mainstream versions of natural selection and neo-Darwinist versions of natural selection. And what we would say about biosemiotics, I suppose, is you know, approaching this ultimately in respect of culture, it's much more complexly determined. It's often determined by semiotic issues rather than what are thought to be strict material issues in biological evolution.
Absolutely, I think that's very important to mention. Yes.
Okay, shall we go on to the next slide? Thank you.
Right.
Oh, so is it the case that you wish to nullify the project of multiculturalism? Are you trying to collapse it simply into biology? When I say you, I mean us.
Yes. So I guess I would say absolutely not, as you would probably say at all. Yes. I think that the rationale of the emergence of culture on the biological evolutionary ladder, or yeah, for simplicity's sake, let's call it ladder for now, is the enhancement of diversity. Culture is not something that makes us, that should make us more peculiar in a way that isolates us from the rest of nature, from the rest from other communities in our species, but enhances our, diversifies our ways of discovering and producing meaning. Such culture, by default, is heterogeneous. Cultures are intrinsically heterogeneous. Cultures are intrinsically diverse, and they are not static systems. They are actually meaning-making engines, if you like, though I don't like the engine metaphor. Meaning-making, or rather, meaning catalysts, I think is a good way of looking at culture. Hence, yeah, culture, to think of culture as homogeneous is empirically false. I think that's obvious to me. And what we should do then is not try to keep cultures homogeneous through policies. That it is that idea that paradoxically multiculturalist theory more often than not endorses. And paradoxically, voting this as multiculturalist policies have more often than not led to isolationism, to the isolation of communities within a state, within a city, and so on. So I guess you would agree with me. I'm in favor of seeking out policies that mix up communities rather than enforce borders which might have been artificial in the first place.
Well, my response to the question again is like yours. It's not at all. That's my short answer. I mean, our answers are so similar that you would almost think that we had actually made up that question ourselves. So that's the first thing that I would observe. You know, it's impossible to nullify the project of multiculturalism. You know, it's ongoing by virtue of the fact that there is such a thing as multiculture, that we can't reverse it. You know, it's in the nature of culture to be multiculture in that respect. I suppose what people might be thinking if they ask such a question is that one benefit to an approach which chops up into small compartments is that with that you can recognize the difference of the other, and you can tolerate the difference, and you can pay tribute to the difference, and you can facilitate the difference, and so on. And of course there is difference in culture. Obviously, you know, it's a fundamental fact that that we have, you know, even from the time that humans were in forager communities, you know, the communities protected themselves with a boundary and so on and so forth. Okay, so we know that that's the case, you know, and that's part of, you know, that's been part and parcel of multiculturalist policy in many places. But I think about issues like tolerance of the other, and I think that there are obviously downsides to tolerance, using that English term, because tolerance suggests putting up with something that's largely intolerable. You know, in that forager community, you hate the other forager community, but in order to not be at war all the time, you put up with them. You know, wouldn't it be nice to get rid of the hate between those communities rather than keeping them at arm's length in a position of safety and so on? I know that there are political issues which may be long-standing and so ossified that makes that a difficult objective. But in a way, that the vocabulary of multiculturalism, you know, it does have a residue of it has a residue of aggression in it, arguably. My position on this has been forged, I think, by listening to Augusto Ponzio and Susan Petrilli, and their position has always been derived from Bakhtin and the work surrounding that school, and also from Levinas. That their idea is that humans are constantly called upon to answer the demand of the other. Okay, it's not something that you can choose to answer. You know, even if you choose not to answer by setting up your own community, which is separate from the other human beings, you are causing trouble for yourself, because that demand will continue. Continue until the end of humans. Okay, so you can't be distanced through toleration, nor can you be distanced in the sense of claiming to initiate a dialogue. Okay, well, I will allow us to speak on this limited basis. For them, there's a more absolute position, and that is that we are always called upon to answer the demand of the other. And of course, I mean, this has implications, as I've written, for how humans are then going to orientate themselves, not just to the rest of the communities that are in a particular locality, but also to the rest of nature.
Indeed. Yeah. I
wish to add anything?
I think that that idea cannot be overestimated. What you just explained is most important, and I there's a lot I would like to. I would like to simply continue it on, but I think we just move on to the next slide, because I think that our next ideas are building up on
okay.
this.
Okay, so here's a challenging question then. You know, you could I mean, this is a kind of a question that I would anticipate, given the background that I've had, you know, particularly in communications and cultural studies, and it's this. Are we suggesting that we wish to replace multiculturalism with a return to universals? You know, haven't postcolonialism and other contemporary perspectives demonstrated the poverty of appeal to universals? Okay, so I will answer first for a change. My answer, I think, to that is definitely yes, they have, and with good reason and intent. I would have to say that, you know, it's not in no way am I opposed to the observations that have been made and the arguments that have been put forward by postcolonialism and those other perspectives which are critical of the idea of universalism. So the reason for that, I think, is that universals are always a problem when they're deployed to obliterate that which makes up the precise political conjuncture in which oppression and marginalization take place, in which identities are constructed. You know, if a colonial force is subjugating unarmed people, then, you know, the argument that we're all humans underneath, it doesn't really wash, because people die in those situations, or people get oppressed, and so on and so forth. However, I would say we're often dealing with universals whenever we consider what it is that humans do. I was quite influenced when I was a younger academic by a book that I read, I think it was in the late 1980s, and it was a book about essentialism, really good book, called Essentially Speaking, by a feminist theorist called Diana Fuss. And the book details the problems of essentialism chapter by chapter. And then, of course, in the final chapter, what it says, which is quite interesting, is that you have to avoid being essentialist about essentialism. And I would say the same as well in respect of universals, that universals are not necessarily automatically villains, you know, because universals are not necessarily essentially categorizable phenomena. So in biosemiotics, we have a universal, this notion that that all creatures model according to the idea of an umwelt. And in this instance, we're talking about humans. So it's the human senses, you know, distributed, embodied, all of those things. But in a way, when we talk about that, we're talking about a universal on the one hand, because it's something that we're saying that all humans have. But on the other hand, you know, which makes it theoretically a challenge to keep discussing it. It's absolutely marked by intense variegation, the human umwelt. So universalism is not, it's not a stable concept in that respect.
Yep, that's an excellent idea. To continue the idea, I would say that I would point out to the fact that the assumption behind the assumption underpinning this sort of question that we're trying to answer here is that in our criticism of cultural relativism and of cultural autonomy, we risk bringing a view that justifies imposing universal rules, right? Which is exactly what post-colonialism did. And my remark to that is that, well, cultural relativism did not properly challenge essentialism. It accepted it in perhaps in different regards than colonialism, but it didn't eradicate it. For instance, all too often it is argued from the point of view of post-colonial anthropology that European colonialists could colonize certain parts of the world because they didn't allow in those places the formation of national identities. And since these colonized communities could not come together under the banner of a nation, could not impose a proportionate challenge to the European colonizers. But the idea of nation is here construed as a universal. And I think it's very important to understand that whatever the universal is, the idea of nation is not a universal of human existence or of anything. It's historically a very new idea. It's, as we historically know, one of the most dangerous and, might I say, criminal ideas. And whether one fancies the idea of nation or not, this much is clear. It is not universal. It is peculiar to European modernity, and it actually has been used to colonize. And by pressuring post-colonial communities to crystallize around national identities is not the way to empower them or to reverse colonialization. Rather, they should have the space, the intellectual space, the cultural space to come up with, to rather develop their own senses of belonging, not the European construal of nation. So in that regard, I guess I'm defending our point of view here by saying Well, yes. First of all, we should not be essentialists about essentialism, but also our intellectual adversaries, our academic adversaries, are not anti-essentialists themselves.
Yes, I mean, it's a slight jump, but since you mentioned national identity, perhaps on the next slide we should say something about identities. So the question might follow: is identity, which is the whole idea of identity was, particularly in the last 50 years, was very much underpinned by semiotics. The semiotic elements of identity were often in theories of identity. But are we saying that that identity therefore is a matter of artifice, or to be dismissed as a kind of false consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, to straightforwardly answer, if I may, accepting that I might be controversial here, my answer is yes. Identity is to be dismissed as a kind of false consciousness. And in my answer here, I think that I'm following Zygmunt Bauman's view. I think he was explicit enough in this regard. He was dissatisfied with, or he found it important to tackle the situation to which modernity has led, of dissolving the former identities, hierarchical identities of the medieval age, but has not dissolved, but modernity did not dissolve identity altogether, the notion of identity, which again, I think, and I understand that I'm controversial here at this stage, identity as well is not a universal. Identity in the sense in which it is understood from early anthropology and further on, that identity which is, if you want, even quantified by social sciences right now, the identity that, for instance, studies on acculturation, starting with Berry, discuss. That is not a universal. It is different. Identity in that sense is different from personhood and from personal fulfillment, or from community, or from belonging to a community. And it of course, that idea of identity mixed with the idea of nation made possible to begin with, or actually gave birth, constituted the Eurocentric view that justified colonialism.
Yes, I mean, returning to that universal issue again, I should put my cards on the table and say that in using the term identity, I'm always very tentative in any case, because I hold on to a very old, seemingly traditional view now, from post-structuralism, from Althusser in particular, of subjectivity. It's kind of pessimistic in the sense that science systems, in a view of subjectivity, in some respects, are seen to dominate the subjects of those particular configurations. But from a more biosemiotic perspective, one thing that I think I would add to what you said is with reference to the human umwelt, and that is that if humans are different from other species, possibly what distinguishes human understanding in John Dewey's sense, a philosopher who's very much aligned with biosemiotics, is that we have got this ability to shift, oscillate, go back and forth very quickly from what he calls mind-independent being and mind-dependent being. And of course, the interesting thing in those two is the second one. You know, a sense of the world which is mind-dependent is very much one that we've explored in semiotics over the last 50, 60, 70 years. But I wonder as well whether it might be the case that what distinguishes human understanding is that through signs, in Dewey's sense, through signs, we have a sense that there is such a thing as a thing.
Yeah.
Or to put it another way, you know, we see something beyond the sign as humans, and it might be that the distinguishing factor is that we trade more in the possibility of things than we do in signs traditionally conceived. Okay, we trade in the idea that our signs might refer to something in the real world that we may not fully apprehend. Ever. You know, and for identity studies, I think that you know might be a key point. Also for study of ideology and other issues to do with cultural forces.
Yeah. On this, there would be a lot to discuss here, and I don't know how we will ever. Your point brings to mind for me is I wish when I wrote the book on multiculturalism, I wish that I was that I knew back then Professor Andach's work on identity from a couple of years ago, where he brings a Persian perspective on identity. I think there's a key there, and yeah, that for now I think I'll just leave it here because I risk getting sidetracked. I want to avoid that.
Well, we should get on to the last slide, I guess, the final slide, the bitter end here, and then we can perhaps have at least a brief time with some of the other participants. So, I mean, just jump in a little bit, but to do with the question of identity and how it's treated. So, what we do as academics. What's the role of the humanities in a period when budgets are squeezed and the humanities are under attack from politicians and public alike? You know, how do we deal with identity in that?
Yeah. Another question that I find very important. Thank you. The way I would put it in so many words is that the humanities in general need to tap into the engineering of the digital age. That's the circumstantial answer that I do for now, because the humanities are now circumstantially in a crisis. I think that we should not be shy in that regard. When I say we should not be, the we means researchers in the humanities. I guess we need to start understanding the hard sciences. You mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that one thing that the discovery of semiotics did to you was to determine you to read more on science, right? And me as well. I had to understand a little bit of evolutionary theory to start understanding biosemiotics and to understand the physiology of cognition, at least a little bit, to understand embodiment theory and so on. And I think that discussions on multiculturalism and or identity are very relevant in this regard, this is exactly a channel through which the humanities can jump in the bigger discussions, because globalization goes hand in hand with digitalization, right? So I think we should contribute to understanding the emerging global communities that are delivered through digitalization. And I have some examples here. For instance, I like very much Clarice de Souza's idea of semiotic engineering, in which I'm recently learning about, and John Soa's formalization of existential graphs into conceptual graphs. I apologize on the slide, I made a typo. It's not computational graphs, it's conceptual graphs that that can be used for coding, for computation. Existential graphs are are Charles Peirce's system of logical notations, and John Soa, a contemporary computer scientist, noticed actually a couple of decades ago that they are very good to describe the logic of computers. They're very good for dialogue with computers, to put it in that simply. But of course, to do that, you need to transform those graphical notations of Peirce into the symbols that we type in the computer. So Soa has formalized them in that way, and that has proven to be an excellently, a very successful approach to the theories and logic underpinning coding. So I think that we need to tap into that. These are explicitly semiotic applications that are critical to digitalization. And again, we should not be shy to jump into that if we want to have an impact aside the small but interesting, of course, world of humanists. Then, as you mentioned earlier, Paul, semiotics can produce, and certainly from a biosemiotic perspective, theories of empathy. We've seen that in the work of Augusto Pozio and Susan Petrilli, which you mentioned. They take on Peirce's doctrine of agapism. Peirce saw by agapism, Peirce meant his idea that besides chance and necessity, very interestingly, selfless love, altruistic love, is a criterion for semiotic evolution. For by semiotic evolution, I mean evolution in general. And Peirce's doctrine can be pretty much labeled metaphysical speculation in this regard, but it can offer a philosophical underpinning to contemporary theories of empathy coming from the social sciences. It can offer a philosophical underpinning to contemporary empirical observations. For instance, I find one example among many, I find very prolific, Jeremy Rifkin's notion of biosphere consciousness. The socioeconomist Jeremy Rifkin considers that for a sustainable globalization, it's very important to acquire an awareness of the interconnectivity of all human beings and indeed all life forms on the earth. So how directly resonating is this with biosemiotics, and particularly with Peirce's agapism? So I think that to get to the point, in view of some biosemiotics can play its role. And I think that I only want to give this as a possible example. Biosemiotics can play a role in understanding and promoting biosphere consciousness, which collapses old notions of cultural or of strict and rigid cultural identities, not to mention cultural purity.
I'm glad you said that. I just wanted to pick out something in particular in order to be as quick as possible so we can start to field some questions. I've been looking in the sidebar and there's some interesting questions already. I just wanted to pick up on science because being from an English-speaking region, I do notice that the difference between the way science appears in English-speaking academia and elsewhere, broadly elsewhere, I would say, in that, science in English, particularly when taken from the vantage point of cultural studies and possibly the humanities in general, it's thought of as being like quite specific. It's thought of as being associated with different approaches. It's associated with institutionalization. It's associated with the hard sciences, particularly paradigms of knowledge from physics. It's associated with all the sort of things that Thomas Kuhn has already deconstructed and shown to be, rhetorical devices and so on. So there's that perspective in the English-speaking world, not exclusively, but like quite dominantly. Yet, whenever I am speaking with colleagues from outside English-speaking regions, and they're speaking to me in English, they talk about science in a much broader way. They talk about it in a way which I prefer, which is to do with rigor, to do with good procedure, and so on and so on. To do with especially thinking that requires hard work. I'm constantly telling my kids, don't think lazily. Don't be guilty of lazy thinking. Now, the assault on the humanities, I think it seldom takes considered forms. The forms that it takes are always crass and philistine. You can't make money from the humanities. There's too much investment needed in the humanities. Humanities doesn't produce new technology, etc., etc. Very sort of one word or one phrase answers to the issue of the humanities. Now, I mean, that's a problem, okay, but I think that there's a bigger problem in the sense that so often the defense of the humanities in these circumstances is carried out in a similarly lazy way, but with a liberal humanist tinge. Now, there will always be a liberal humanist version of identity somewhere in the humanities because of its history, because of the way that it grew out of a humanist impetus. And so that's entrenched without a doubt. However, I would say that the worst part of that is the myth that, and this is the sort of one phrase response, the myth that the humanities should be preserved, firstly, because they make people good, okay, and then secondly, the idea that the humanities are inherently good, so we can't question the humanities. Yeah. Of course, we can question them. I think what biosemiotics contributes to the debate isn't to do with, it's more scientific in this respect, more rigorous in this respect, because it's not to do with what's good and what's bad. Instead, it's concerned with the role of the humanities in respect of comparative Umwelten. Okay, the arts and humanities, to put it in a soundbite or in as simple a form as possible, without indulging in lazy thinking, the arts and humanities are central to the future of modelling on planet Earth.
Exactly. To modelling in an academic sense and also in the world out there. Humanities, what has been called humanities, what comes out of that tradition, the intellectual tradition, has much to say about how we arrived at the Anthropocene as a human remodeling of the Holocene.
There are 3 excellent questions that I saw in the Q&A sidebar.
Yes, I see.
are you happy to answer them in their entirety rather than me?
I'm happy to give it a try.
I'll tell you what they are. We'll start with the first one from Elia Cornelio. It seems a bit Eurocentric to link the notion of identity exclusively to European colonialism. There must have been a sense of belonging to local communities before the emergence of the nation state, right? So, well, good point.
Yeah,
Alin, do you know the answer to this?
I don't know the answer to this. I think it's a very important note to make. So thank you very much for this question. Yeah, so it seems a bit Eurocentric to link the notion of identity exclusively to European colonialism. So I think that's an important remark, and you got me a bit offside there. I rushed when I say that, as you asked me that, I understand. So thank you very much for the question, because it's not unlikely at all that the same or a very similar concept emerged somewhere else. But I don't know if it actually did. But the possibility, the competence, not the competence, the likelihood that some non-European communities had a similar way of organizing themselves should not be excluded. Yes, by all means. Now, I do not know. I mean, of course, now the concept of nation is well acknowledged and assumed, unfortunately, I would say, pretty much everywhere, almost everywhere outside Europe. But I think that in every place that I can think of, it's a result of a European or American, North American, which is still European in that culturalist sense, imposition of it. Would you know, Paul, to give an example?
I don't know the history well enough, but probably what I would say is that the national identities as they grew up, especially in Europe, were so rapacious and so so inherently imperialistic that in a way, I suppose what you could argue is that whatever identities pre-existed national identities, they were colonized.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not based on extensive historical knowledge of the period, just fairly standard knowledge of the period. So,
and of course, I mean, for instance, Benedict Anderson, which I guess is the landmark reference in this regard, locates the nation in the context, in pretty much the context of European colonization of North America.
But great question, great point for debate. Now we go on to Zeke, who I talked to a few days ago. Delighted to see you here, and I'm putting some serious questions. I like this question a lot. He says, do you think the concept multiculturalism could be extrapolated to non-human relations in a productive way? For example, to refer to animal populations, including different groups of individuals? Do you think ecological semiosis could be understood as an aggregate of multicultural sign systems? So challenging, but not just provocative, quite stimulating.
Yeah, indeed. I think I have certainly not complete, but immediate remark to make. Thank you very much for the question. I think we don't. I need some time to think on it, but the way I feel about it now, I don't think that the concept of multiculturalism could or should be extrapolated to non-human relations, yeah. But that keeping in mind that culture is a means by which natural evolution catalyzes meaning diversities, catalyzes semiotic competencies, we're prone to accept that non-human species that have culture show degrees of semiotic diversity, if that makes sense. So I don't know how being a bit humoristic now, I don't know how you would use multiculturalism to mitigate between two colonies of ants that go at war with each other. But I think that keeping in mind that yeah, but I think that you're right that this is the key there, right? That ecological semiosis, which we can have an idea of what we mean by it, can be understood as an aggregate of science systems which are multicultural in non-human species that about which we know empirically have culture.
Just to add to this, Zeke, I think it can't be answered, you know, in the space of a session like this. You know, it requires a book or a project or something. But you know, I think the issue that you raise is absolutely one central to the kind of thing that biosemiotics is trying to do, in the sense that we've alluded to the possibility of consanguinity between species on the planet. And you know, that's not just a matter of saying, aren't bonobo chimps very like humans, you know, we should take more care of them. It's about continuity across, well, I don't know how you would study it, but there may be that there are certain ways of isolating traits or characteristics across species, which might, in this argument, I can't say much more, but in this argument might, in political terms, be brought to fruition.
Yeah, exactly.
So I hope that's kind of, well, it's left the question open, but I hope it's addressed it to a certain extent. Now, I'm terrible with Polish names, so this is Maciej Biedzinski. Are communities possible from the point of view of cultures and identities being essentialists, or is there simply a community? If so, how does such a community give ontological grounding to individuals? Brilliant. That's kind of thing that I would have read in Diana Fuss's book. So I don't know is my answer to that, but it's a good question. Alin, did you wish to respond?
Brilliant question indeed. Thank you. It helps me understand the implications of the arguments that we discussed. I'll simply try to give opinions for the sake of sharing my opinions. Are communities possible from the point of view of cultures and identities being essentialist? No, it kills. Actually, if there was a enclosed culture in an essentialist sense, with a mono identity of the sorts corresponding, I think community would not be possible. Just in the same way in which, if we could communicate with absolute precision, we could not communicate. Making an analogy for the sake of brevity, I know it's a leap there. And then you go on to ask, or is there simply a community? So my answer, I guess, would be no. If so, you continue, how does such a community give ontological grounding to individuals? Well, yeah, I simply think that if what anthropology has been claiming for quite a while about cultures would be real, there would be no community for the sake of the mental exercise.
Just one thing to say, you know, and this might sound like I'm being pedantic, but you ask about ontological grounding to individuals, and I would say once again being old-fashioned, I would say ontological grounding to subjects, is often given by communities, but it's a matter of kind of breaking out of that. Something about bourgeois thought. Bourgeois thought has been very good at appropriating and exploiting first-person experience, and I think that one of the concerns, it's kind of, it's not an absolutely core concern, but it's certainly there in biosemiotics, that we're interested in trying to give some grounding to first-person experience, across species, in fact, as well, even though some species don't come under the category of person. Okay, so next question. This is from Omar Paredes. This notion of dynamic heterocontinuum, if I could put it like this, it's good. Either spatial or temporal is fascinating, because this search for homogenization or segregation and tolerance ends up in disciplines fighting each other or following independent paths. Biosemiotics versus code biology. Okay, so this is very informed, as an example of the former, and semiotics and biosemiotics as an example of the latter. True. How to explore an idea following this dynamic heterocontinuum approach, not to be merely eclectic. Oh, I wish I knew the answer to this. I guess you're concerned about sectarianism. I hope that this doesn't sound like a trite answer, but one of the things that we've tried to do in the International Association is to exploit some facts beyond the sectarianism. So, some of the people who are not biosemiotics are very good friends. I like them a lot. So yes, so you exploit friendship in that respect. I think togetherness, which we're suffering from a lack of so often in the COVID world, we're coming to appreciate in ways which are not as sentimental as we thought them in the past. Alin.
Yep, this is an excellent question, and I like very much the wording heterocontinuum. I feel I'm jealous that I didn't have the idea to talk about heterocontinuum, the implications of Persian synergism for how we regard culture. Your question reminds me of a paper that I find very inspiring by Susan Gall and Judith Irvine from the 90s. The paper is called "The Boundaries of Language and Disciplines: How Ideologies Construct Difference." It's very likely that many people are familiar with the paper. It has been quite impactful. And Gall and Irvine in this paper take a Persian perspective to criticize the negative consequences of, to criticize the compartmentalization of humanities and social sciences, and point out to the epistemological problems that this compartmentalization brings. And when I read that paper, I sometimes get lost, as the title of the paper says. The title of the paper reads, again, "Boundaries of Languages and Disciplines." Sometimes in this paper, I get lost and I don't know anymore whether Gall and Irvine are discussing differences between academic paradigms or cultural ideologies, which is to say they're doing both in the direction, I think, in which this very well put question brings. Yeah, much less than all.
Alin, we've got two more questions, and after what I've just said, I'm ashamed to say that they're both from very good friends of mine. I wonder if it'd be possible to allow Jose Enrique Finol to speak on screen, because he's got his hand up.
That would be very good.
Okay, is that possible?
Yeah, let me see explore it. Nicolás, ¿estás allí?
Claro que sí, cuéntame.
Por favor, ¿me puedes subir al profesor José Enrique Finol? Paul, don't forget we need to have the closer. So
yes, I know we're already very late, aren't we? Let's take a few questions quick because I'm interested to hear them.
Yes, just let me know when I projected the slide.
Okay.
Hello, Paul.
Hi, good to hear you. Hope you're well.
Very nice to see you, and it's a pleasure to hear you in this conversation. Since we have just a few minutes, I would like to say just two things. The first one is, well, I disagree absolutely with Alin. I think that identity is a concept based on empirical facts that operates against alterity, because people recognize themselves as having common traits with other people, and at the same time they recognize themselves as having difference with other groups of people. And so I think that the concept of identity cannot be related to false conscience, as Bowman says. So I think that this concept is very useful if we try to develop in a deeper way. For example, when talking about multiculturalism, I think that it is necessary to deepen this concept, maybe talking about interculturality, transculturality, because sometimes we are caught in these terms of oppositions, and we forget to see what is in the middle of those concepts, and we forget to see the dynamic of these concepts. And I would like to hear your comments about that. But finally, I would say that I have enjoyed both communication, but the dialogue has been wonderful, and I congratulate you for your participation. I have been very happy listening to your ideas, and I have provoked on my own work a very interesting reflection, I think. Thank a lot. I think I speak for all the audience. Has been very, very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jose Enrique. You're kind. We will probably have to wrap up quite quickly, so I would like to address your question, but I'm aware that there are questions, a very difficult one from my friend Seema Kamvalka, in which she asks about essentialism and biosemiotics being reconciled, particularly in Asian countries. There's one from Jorge about universality and ways of materializing people's feelings, and then one from Natasha Lakovic, which is extremely interesting question about translating complex and random relational and system awareness approaches in teaching and pedagogy, especially online. So very topical in that respect. We will try to get to you, I think, after this session's finished. We'll try to get to you by email, or because we'd certainly like to discuss those questions. But if I could just say something about Jose Enrique's intervention, I think absolutely right. I think what you said in some ways acts as a very important corrective to perhaps those moments when we were more excessive about the expansive possibilities of getting beyond a kind of chopping up perspective, perspective on culture, which is not synarchistic. I think particularly being an old post-structuralist as well, I think what is in the margins, what is between boundaries, what is left over all the time in all cultural approaches, including possibly those that we are espousing in some respects here, is extremely important, extremely important for the future as well, because it's a herald of what is to come quite frequently. And, you can see that in a lot of movements that we're experiencing now on planet Earth. Alin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Professor Finol for this question. I'll try to briefly answer. This is a very important question because it helps me clarify where I stand in this regard. So I would claim that that so far we haven't been presented with empirical evidence to acknowledge, to justify a notion such as a semiotic boundary, the boundary between two semiotic systems. But I know, yes, the concept of identity, as mostly used in the humanities and social sciences, is rooted in empirical research and empirical observation. And I wouldn't say, I hope that I didn't say that by some mistake, I wouldn't say that is empirically unfounded, but I would say that in the way in which it was construed in the social sciences, for instance, as an example, take the landmark concept of identity coming from Berry in studies on acculturation. That concept of identity, which is empirically based, it has been developed in light of a flawed assumption in the humanities. It has been taken over from anthropology, which took it over from 19th century Romanticism. And I think that the way in which it has been dealt with for a long time, even if based on empirical observation, has been theoretically flawed. Because it started with the assumption of the possibility to clearly separate, in our terms, semiotic systems and therefore identities corresponding to them. And very interestingly, it is more recent empirical research that does not completely undermine, indeed, that notion of identity, the empirical reality of it, but has pointed out to contradictions that it generated in theory. I hope I'm managing to answer.
Alin, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry to bring this part of our discussion to an end, but what I am forced to do, I think now, because time is tight, I have an announcement to make, and I wonder if it'd be possible first for Jorge to share the screen, which he has. I would like to make this announcement with Maria as well. Maria, are you able to speak? Okay, possibly.
Sorry, I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Okay, good. I thought you were
Yes.
on mute.
Sorry.
So let's make an announcement now, and then I have a further announcement in the way of closing the session and closing the series. But amongst all the people to whom we've given acknowledgements, and we've heard those, and there have been lists of those. I won't go through them again because it's getting late. But I'm extremely grateful to everybody that's been involved in this. But above all, I should say something about Neil Pardo, because we met 6 or 7 years ago, and I must admit, when we met in a social situation, and I liked her immensely because she was very funny and she thought that I was funny. So that was great to meet on a social basis. But then I went to see a paper that she gave and it was fantastic. And then a few years ago, I went to see the FELS conference. I attended the FELS conference in Bogota, and I was absolutely staggered with the magnitude of that event, the excellence of the event, and the tour de force of organization that it must have taken. So we're dealing with somebody who is really formidable here, and I think it's with every appropriateness that she is to be awarded officially this token of gratitude, which is a certificate of appreciation. Maria, would you like to add anything?
Yes, thank you, Paul.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, great. So I'd like to read a text that Jorge and I wrote together for Neila. Dr. Neila Graciela Pardo Abril is a professor at the Faculty of Humanities at the National University of Colombia in Bogotá. She is currently the Vice President for the Americas of the International Association for Semiotic Studies. She has been the President of the Latin American Federation of Semiotics and of the Colombian Association of Semiotics. She is very dedicated to her students and her research team and colleagues. She has developed several studies with international scholars in the field of violence, forced displacement, and consequences of wars in countries where inequality have been a constant problem. She has brought together all of us, the early career researchers in semiotic studies around the world, aiming at building a strong network to promote meaningful and critical discussions of social and communicational problems under a semiotic perspective. Last year, in the World Congress of Semiotics in Buenos Aires, Professor Neila encouraged the association to recognize the relevance of the management and reunion of the early career researchers as a sign of the change which our international association needed for its future. So, she has opened the doors for the new ways of thinking and researching new perspectives that semiotic studies may add to the exploration of the present and complex global scenario. So we would like to thank you, Neila, very much for all your contribution to our reunion. We are very happy to be together. Jorge has also, I don't know if everybody is already connected to us, but I'd like to reinforce that we have a group in WhatsApp that if anybody that's here today is not connected to us, please write us an email and get connected. Stay in touch.
Thank you very much,
Professor.
Maria. Thank you. Dear Paul, dear all, thank you very much. I'm very touched by such beautiful detail that I do not deserve. This has been a team for. Thank you. Thank you very much. I can't talk more. Thank you.
Okay, so Neila, you know how we feel. Moving on, I would like to I'm very honored to take this opportunity to close the entire series. I'm glad that you asked me to do that. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to open it. I was actually on holiday that week. You know, do you remember when people used to have holidays? I managed to have one summer. So just a few words to close this this entire series, and I will be as quick as possible. Fantastic series, a community building series, a contribution to semiotics globally, and a massive boost to the early career researchers. I think very excellent to be brought together, but also to give a boost through discussion and through involvement and through interactive work between older scholars and early career scholars. Not necessarily younger people. Not everybody's young, but you can be an early career scholar and still be fairly long in the tooth. So all of those things definitely. But one set of people that I should thank especially are all of the early career researchers that were involved in this project, either as attendees or as participants and speakers. And in particular, I would like to thank Jorge and Alin, who have for many years before this series of conversations started, have been pushing on the idea of early career researchers. And that, I think, has come to its first fruition in this series, but it will come to a more symbolic and material fruition when we are all together in Thessaloniki. because we have an early careers researchers in semiotic studies network, which to an extent is virtual, but we will launch this as an ongoing concern when we meet in Thessaloniki for the next World Congress, which is in 2022, is it? I forget the years. Yeah, 2022 it will be. So that will be an auspicious event that that the IASS will be completely behind, and it will be a collective endeavour, but it will bear our imprint, and it bodes very well for the future of semiotics globally. Just one final plea. This might seem a little bit mercenary to suggest this, but if there is anybody here who hasn't become a member of the International Association for Semiotic Studies, I would like to urge you to do so, not because it brings urgent funds into the organization. I mean, it does to a certain extent, but it's extremely cheap. It's about 4 times cheaper than most scholarly associations, 25 euros to join, and you get some benefits from De Gruyter for joining the IASS. But the most important thing of all is it brings us into a community of scholars globally, and we can extend not privileges, but communal advantages to all those who are a member of this association. We've got quite a distinguished history, and we need you to make a distinguished future as well. Is there anything else that I should add, Nela, Maria?
Thank you.
I guess people are tired now.
I have just received this in this moment. It's I don't know.
It's quite
it's beautiful detail that I don't know. I think it's one recognition for the world team. I compare it to all, for my college, for Jorge, for all the people who implied in this project. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. As president, I will give the final thank you. I look forward to us being reunited, but insofar as we've been united in our cause on this occasion, it's been a quite beautiful experience, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for all of your participation.
Thank you. I'm very nervous. I can't to talk more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you
Maria, thank you very much for all. Alin, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And last but not least, I want also to thank you in the name of our faculty, the Education Faculty of the University of Antioquia. And of the bottom of my heart, I'm very proud of this kind of academic events. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Nela.
See you.
Thank you, everybody.
See you. Okay, bye-bye.